Yeah, I think after hearing Harvey's presentation, I think I'm going to retire from journalism and, and writing books and become a demographer. That's really cool stuff. That's fantastic. I scribbled a bunch of notes. Anyways, yeah, so I'm a long-time community resident. The 2-minute version is when Gary was talking about Oakwood Collegiate, I actually attended Oakwood Collegiate in the 80s. So again, scribbling more notes. Yeah, I was sitting there frantically scribbling all these notes. So I went there in the 80s, and I'd rented apartments going all the way over west to Dufferin and St. Clair. Onto Atlas Avenue, where I currently reside. I rented apartments throughout the whole neighborhood, going as far west as Keele, right over to Bathurst, and now live on Atlas Avenue, all right? So over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about, the presentation is called The Darker Side of St. Clair. So that wasn't to be, grim or to put a, dark cloud over the presentation, but it was essentially just to talk about some black community developments around things having to do with entrepreneurship, things having to do with activism, music and popular culture, all right? Because there are some very historically relevant things that had happened here over the years that maybe not a lot of people quite know so much about. So as both Gary and Harvey referenced this idea of the neighborhood being branded, certainly there's the Little Italy aspects. I lived around here when Italy won the World Cup, 82 and and it was just, a chaos. It was, good chaos, celebration, community pride. And so we see some of those open and obvious community settlement patterns. Italian communities, certainly with the advent of salsa and St. Clair. So we see a lot of Latin American, sort of retention patterns celebrating the community. And it's almost getting, I agree with you, that kind of branding. People are somehow feeling that it's a little pocket of Latin American activity, rightly or wrongly. Now, if you dig a little deeper, what you'll find is that there are actually a lot of African Canadian or black community retentions in the neighborhood, so I want to talk a little bit about how did these clusters of community members and entrepreneurs and musicians and activists end up in and around St. Clair. So basically, when I was living on right off Atlas on St. Clair, I managed this project. It's called Jamaica to Toronto, 1967 to 1974. And what it was basically a collection of musicians that had come here in the late 60s to the early 60s. And, their narrative sort of, mimicked migration patterns of Caribbean citizens to Toronto. When you talk to most people from the Caribbean, they will have said, my parents came here, grandparents. It was around that time. It was when loosened immigration, restrictions, 67 to mid-70s. So this is where you found a lot of them ended up in Toronto in general, never mind St. Clair. Now, around this time, when we talk about Toronto, music and popular culture, we hear a lot about happenings in places like Yorkville. So we hear that Yorkville was once a home. People like Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, hung out in Yorkville and were jamming open mics. And, it was quite hippy-dippy, apparently, from what I've read. And now, so buried slightly underneath these narratives lay a lot of really incredible human interest stories as it relates to Caribbean community members. And so when we launched this project, Jamaica to Toronto, 1967 to 74, we essentially generated, major press, like Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, Now Magazine, cover stories everywhere, because it was sort of this narrative that was, hidden deep underneath Joni Mitchell and Neil Young isms, And now part of that narrative, it happened to land smack dab in the middle of, on St. Clair. So when we think about music, when people still bought music, like people still went to record stores, that's so 90s. Basically, you had along St. Clair, you had vinyl outlets, places that sold vinyl specifically, and the neighborhood along St. Clair actually used to be a hotbed of black music and tradition, okay? Dating, in the 70s, 80s, certainly. And so when we talk about this neighborhood, St. Clair, and its relationship to just north of here, which is Eglinton Avenue West. So just north of here, Eglinton Avenue West, they have this little pocket that runs between Marley Avenue and right over to about Oakwood. And it's a neighborhood that's affectionately referred to as Little Jamaica, okay? And it's where a lot of Torontonians, you want to get your jerk chicken or beef patty fix, they head there, right? It's called Little Jamaica. And so when we talk about the history of, music production in the neighborhood, and people wanting to buy, get those feelings from back home. A lot of people came here for a quote-unquote, better life, but they wanted to get feelings of back home. They wanted to buy calypso music. They wanted to buy reggae music, certainly blues, ska music. They would head to either Eglinton Avenue West in Toronto or St. Clair, okay? So this picture here is actually of this guy. His name is Lord Tanamo. And Lord Tanamo is best known as this mento and ska performer, right? So he's an iconoclast, a total legend. Now, he had a record store right at basically Vaughan and Bathurst, okay? And the reason I mentioned this is that Lord Tanamo just happened to be one of the co-inventors of a music form called ska, okay? Ska, as we say, S-K-A, okay? So when we think of ska, some people would have interacted with it. It could have been in the 80s, you know, the two-tone ska, a band called the Specials, English Beat, you know, in England. So this guy here who had a shop on St. Clair, it was one of the co-inventors of the whole music form, okay, Lord Tanamo. And the record store, he co-owned it with another guy whose name was Jackie Matu. And Jackie Matu is another one of those, you look up his name, Google his name, he has recording credits with some of the biggest and most, world-renowned reggae artists of our time. He worked out of a studio called Studio One in Jamaica. Studio One produced a lot of early Bob Marley recordings, right? So Bob Marley and the Wailers, right? So these guys, we're talking about co-inventors of a whole music form that has spanned the globe, but were hanging out on St. Clair during the 70s, okay, and had a record shop where you could buy vinyl. Now, as far as you can kind of see some of those relics of the Caribbean culture, even kind of to this day. I guess right up until the time, I think you might have addressed this yesterday. I wasn't here, but the St. Clair streetcar project, right up until around 2004, 2005. Even a little later, you would have seen even small traces of this reggae music retention. So there was a store called S&W Sound King that was right on Kenwood Avenue, and while everybody is buying CDs and downloading music, they still sold vinyl. So you'd go there and get like 45-inch records and vinyl records, right? Which is something that there's a whole people now are starting to buy vinyl again. A lot of people, music geeks, ethnomusicologists, but you could find vinyl on Eglinton and St. Clair, while the rest of the city is certainly doing CDs and digital culture. Like HMV and Sunrise Records. This is where a hotbed for vinyl music. All right. And when we talk about even, tying it even, to Bob Marley and the Wailers, if you look dig a little deeper, you even see, relationships of people that lived around here to Bob Marley and the Wailers themselves, right? So this Jamaica to Toronto project, the keyboardist that was part of this project, Lloyd Del Pratt, he's a guy who has recording credits with Bob Marley and the Wailers, okay, that hung around here, all right? Also, too, when we talk about entrepreneurship, there are a couple shops closer to Christie, St. Clair and Christie. You'll notice there's a shop there if you take a little walk sometime this weekend if you get a chance. There's a store there, a Wailers restaurant and lounge, okay? And, aptly named after Bob Marley and the Wailers, and the people in there are hardcore reggae and music enthusiasts. And then to the going just east of there, there's a Caribbean restaurant called Jerry's. Okay, that's been there since 1977, right? So if you dig a little deeper, we know of the the Italian Canadian community's contributions. We see salsa on St. Clair, a lot of Latin American. We see the Portuguese for sure. But if you look around, you're going to see these very historically relevant things having to do with the Black community. Now, when we talk about activism in Toronto in general, in its relation to the Caribbean or the Black community, there are some major, community members, most of whom have passed on recently, that have a lot to do with the way, the Black community, relates to, let's say, police community relations. And I wanted to highlight a couple of these people because they lived around here their whole lives. So there's one neighborhood festival. When we talk about salsa on St. Clair's, there's a lot of festival activity happening in Toronto now. They say Toronto, as the fourth largest city in North America, we host an infinite number of music festivals, right? We have the most film festivals, they say on the planet, and music is maybe following close behind. There was one neighborhood resident who actually co-founded Caravana, right? Which is it's now called the Scotiabank Caribbean Carnival of Toronto. But that thing that we call Caravana or Scotiabank Caribbean Carnival of Toronto, that's largely considered to be the largest Caribbean culture festival of its kind in North America, okay? And a longtime neighborhood resident is one of the people that co-founded it. And his name was Charles Roach, and he passed away a couple of years ago. And he was a human rights activist and lawyer whose law firm, Roach, Schwartz & Associates, actually sat atop this bakery right on Christie Street. And so people flock here from the Caribbean, Latin America, certainly many parts of the U.S. to attend this Scotiabank Caribbean Carnival. Its co-founder was out here. It was his brainchild, 1967. There's a whole deep, rich history there. Now, we talk about Charles Roach also, too. He was sort of popular. He's kind of known as the guy who challenged, when you take an oath to the Queen, when you want to become a Canadian citizen. So he's actually the guy that sort of launched those whole proceedings to him not wanting to essentially take an oath, because basically the Queen, what that represents to many people of certainly Caribbean descent and other regions of the world is, colonization process and some things that are quite ugly, So he kind of launched a, legal action to say, no, I shouldn't have to pay homage to the Queen when it was England that colonized my country and the region, and it left some very not so great after effects. All right, so this is the same guy that lived just up the street, maybe about a 5-minute walk from here. Now, when we talk about even the spirit of activism, Charles Roach was also a guy. He co-founded an organization that was based around here. Called Black Action Defense Committee, all right? So when we talk about how many of you all here are familiar with the SIU, by a show of hands, Special Investigations Unit? Okay, right? So when we talk about civilian oversight bodies that sort of are there to look at things related to police accountability, there was a whole rash of incidences around police brutality and heavy impacts to the African Canadian community in particular. So it was through the work, the activisms of Charles Roach, the same guy who co-founded Caravana, and this other fellow, Dudley Laws, who passed away a couple of years ago. They founded this organization called the Black Action Defense Committee, and that was based again right at Oakwood and St. Clair, right, which is just another about 5-minute walk from here. Okay, so whenever anybody researches, police brutality, police black community relations, most of those roads are going to ultimately end back down here to St. Clair, to the Black Action Defense Committee, the late Dudley Laws, the late Charles Roach, who was a civil rights lawyer and activist. And they still, to this day, have this celebration, Dudley Laws Day, to celebrate his contributions to having, young people feel a bit more safe if they happen to be, a black community member. And in fact, it's interesting, when we talk about, black history, the rich, deep, potent black histories, I actually part of the reason I became a journalist, I started working at Now Magazine back in the 90s for about 10 years, I was this kind of bookish guy that used to hang out in Charles Roach's offices. So we used to have like reading groups, to read about culture and history, about world history, read about what's going on in Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, indigenous black communities. It was at Charles Roach. I'm largely a byproduct of hanging out at Charles Roach's office, the guy who founded Caravana and is largely responsible for the creation of the SIU in Toronto. All right, and now as far as talk a little bit even Oakwood Collegiate, because Gary touched on some interesting things there. Sometimes when we look at the African Canadian community and where it's gone, right? So back in the 80s, 70s, into the 90s, the numbers, as far as when we talk about demographics, it was quite larger. There was this whole kind of like a black flight phenomenon where you look at the 905 region, you look at Brampton, certainly Malton, Mississauga, where a lot of them left, okay? Because a lot of them were, when we talk about immigration patterns in general, the macro, you're looking for places affordability, accessibility, and many immigrants don't have to be black and of African descent. It's cheaper housing, out in the 905 region, or it certainly was back in the 80s and 90s and late 70s. Not so much sure what's happening now, because from what I'm hearing, some of the real estate, it's starting to really skyrocket. So that was what happened with the black community around here, fled to 905, Malton, Brampton, Mississauga, and so Oakwood Collegiate, as far as tying it back into Oakwood Collegiate, it's interesting that you mentioned that it was one of the first schools to sort of take on UNESCO, to be attached to a world human rights organization. While I was there, that was one of its the claim to fame. I was part of that Afro-Can club. So not sure how many of you live in Toronto or have children or attended TDSB schools, but Oakwood was the school that had the first African Canadian club, like student club, right, in Toronto, TDSB schools. And I was, loosely a part of that tradition as a member of that club. And what we used to like to say about Oakwood is it was almost like the United Nations there in the 80s, right? There's been a bit of a demographic shift, but we used to do things that Harvey does, as far as the demographics. And we do these charts and say, okay, there are 900 people that attend Oakwood Collegiate, and we do this sort of independent research, right? This sort of informal, unofficial polls, and look at where people are coming from. And you would see an equal number of, when we posted our results on the chalkboards in the schools, you would see an equal number of, like South Asian community residents, Asian, First Nations, African Canadian, Middle Eastern, Eastern European, and it just goes on and on like that. Like it was crazy. Like literally, 10% Black, 10% South Asian, 10% Asian, and that's what it looked like in the 80s. So it was really like a model, sort of like a United Nations styled, school in the 80s, right? So thanks for bringing that up. I like that. And then also too, when we talk about music and popular culture, and certainly athletics, what we find happening now, for any sports junkies out there, what's happening is a lot of, in our community, there's some very good, in the Black community, very good basketball programs, as there are other programs, but basketball in particular. Oakwood Collegiate has had this long reputation over the last 35, 40 years of being like a basketball powerhouse in Ontario. Never mind the GTA, but in Ontario. So you look at something like... Actually, let's go to the last slide there, if we can just go through a couple. Go to the last slide, thank you. So this year, the OFSA, as far as the Ontario, we can go right to the last one there. So the Ontario basketball champions come from Oakwood Collegiate this year, this school year, 2014, come from Oakwood Collegiate, all right? Just 3 years ago, they won the Ontario Championships again, right? When I went to Oakwood in the 80s, late 80s, we came third in Ontario, right? So there's a really strong basketball tradition. And what that tended to do was to link a lot of these small pockets of basketball training programs, activities. Kids that would, from my community would ultimately try to get into Oakwood, or use fake addresses, or have their or beg their parents to like move into an apartment, or maybe purchase some real estate in the neighborhood, so they could play for the Oakwood Collegiate Barons and win city championships and become Ontario provincial champs, right? So when you see a lot of African Canadian, certainly young men, teenagers walking around, and you do see that, a lot of them, some of them anyways, play for the Oakwood Barons, which is a sort of a national, a very positive program nationally. All right, now just to wrap up, when I talk about the African Canadian community in this neighborhood and how it's been received, we talked a little bit about certainly activism, entrepreneurship. Touched on some of the music, historically relevant music that's coming out of the neighborhood. I would also like to say, it hasn't been all smooth sailing, all right? So just recently, when we talk about TDSB schools, Toronto School Board, there was a movement to have one of the Afrocentric schools be located at Oakwood Collegiate a couple years ago, all right? So the Afrocentric school concept was introduced in Toronto in 2009, and it was introduced to basically address the high dropout rates amongst African Canadian student school members, right? So when we look at high dropout rates, back to demographics, we look at the Portuguese community, dropout rates are just incredibly high. Aboriginal, First Nations community, incredibly high. Black community members, very high. So this Afrocentric schools concept developed in 2009, and apparently, a lot of Black students, and certainly like myself, we weren't feeling any connection to curriculum. When we were studying human history and studying geography, didn't see ourselves reflected. And they have all of these reasons and variables as to why kids are feeling disconnected from schools, right? And the dropout rate is really it's a tragedy of epic proportions. That's a whole other conversation. So there was a move a couple years ago to set up an Afrocentric high school over at Oakwood to have those kids who were coming out of the Shepherd Public School, which is Canada's first Afrocentric academy, public school, to have them ultimately, once they graduate, go to middle school and high school, that they come and attend Oakwood Collegiate. All right? It's a bit of a pilot project kind of thing. Now, what happened, there was a community meeting that happened a little while back, and wow, it was almost like a scene out of filmmaker Spike Lee. He had a film called Do the Right Thing, and where you saw community residents clashing, African Americans clashing against largely Italian and non-Black community interests, and that's what happened at that meeting. Essentially, a lot of the community members that might have been from the dominant culture or non-Black, at the meeting there was a big pushback to say, no, we don't feel that this Afrocentric, this Black learning academy should be, at Oakwood Collegiate. It might disrupt something of the social fabric. A lot of Black community members sort of interpreted that as being, kind of carrying a bit of racist tendencies. That's how it was interpreted within the community. And then people on the Black community side were kind of saying, what's the issue with us having an Afrocentric, school and community based at Oakwood Collegiate, right? So it was a very, very deeply disheartening community meeting for anybody here that had heard about it or read about it in Toronto Life. Toronto Star was covered quite widely and extensively. So just to wrap up, I'd like to say that if you have any questions, after about how the Black community played a huge role in this community, because it is buried underneath a lot of layers, But if you look close enough, you ask around, you can speak to community members who can tell you stories about how their uncle produced tracks for Bob Marley and the Wailers, invented music forms like ska. Which some of us, the Specials English beat. It's a global music form, and also about popular culture and athletics. This is a real hotbed. If you're even remotely interested in, the Toronto Raptors, over to high school basketball, you follow college basketball, U of T, Ryerson. A lot of great stories are circulated, certainly in this neighborhood. And also, too, when we talk about basketball, you can find quite literally. This is the running joke amongst former Oakwoodites, is that you can find Oakwood Barons pretty much at all levels of basketball nationally. Toronto Raptors, one of the assistant coaches, this guy named Jama, he went to Oakwood Collegiate. You talk about the Canadian national basketball team, one of the assistant coaches, Greg Francis, he went to Oakwood. I played with him when we were ranked number 1 in Ontario, and you just find Oakwoodites pretty much everywhere when you're looking at pop culture and certainly and athletic endeavors in Canada. Okay, thank you.